Hey, what's up, ORU? Welcome to the Student Life Leadership Podcast.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for the Student Life Leadership Podcast. I'm Augustine, and today our conversation is featuring Sam Kyle, who works in our Missions and Outreach office. Sam and I also went to school here together in undergrad, and now we get to work on staff together, so that's super awesome. Sam, thanks for joining us today for this podcast episode. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be sharing during this podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Augustine, so much for having me. What an honor it is to be here. Like Augustine mentioned, for a lot of students who don't know, Augustine was actually my chaplain years ago, back on one of the greatest floors of all time in EMR, 4 South, G-Rock.
Come on.
And so Augustine was one of the best chaplains, floor leaderships that you could have. And then we also served on mission staff together as students. And so it's an honor to be able to be here and sharing. So today, I'm going to be sharing about how to lead when you are not in charge. So we talk a lot here at ORU about leadership and developing our own leadership and our own influence. But we also know that there's a lot of times when we're not the ones in charge. Does that mean we just take a back seat? Does that mean that we just stop leading or we're not responsible for our own actions? But really, I want to take a little bit of time here of how can we, as Spirit-empowered leaders and future leaders, kingdom leaders, fathers, mothers, wives, husbands, best lead when maybe our position doesn't deem us the leader. And so to kind of build a foundation of the talk today, I just want to mention briefly a few myths about leadership and then a few truths about leadership, and then I want to break down 5 action steps to leading when you're not in charge. I want this to be as practical as possible. I'm going to share resources, books, podcasts that have really helped and shaped my leadership along the way. I want to share that with you guys. However, I do want to start this and say I by no means am really that qualified to share this talk. I have so much to learn, so much to grow. I even going through some of my notes and thinking about what am I going to share on this podcast, I was convicted in myself of areas that I've been lacking. And you know what? There are ways that I can step it up and lead in my own role where I'm at. And so I want to share some of those with you guys and learn with you guys as we talk about leading when we're not in charge. So a few myths about leadership. 1, it's based upon a position. Leadership is not only positional. If we wait to have the position, what we'll find is that we're usually not prepared when we're in that position. And so leadership is not only positional. Another myth about leadership is that leaders are only doers. One of my favorite, you can call it a leadership proverb, I've heard it said, is he who thinketh. Thanks, Augustine. We're speaking King James here. So he who thinketh he leadeth, but has no one following, is simply going on a walk.
Wow.
And so if we're leading and all we're doing is doing, but no one's following, we're not actually leading, we're just doing. Another myth is leaders need to be the best at what they do. We can strive for excellence. We want to strive to be the best in everything that we do, because everything we do, we believe we do it unto the Lord. However, leaders aren't always just the best at what they do. Oftentimes I've seen it where the best leaders just have the best teams. And so we'll talk about that here in a second as well.
That's
but a few truths to kind of add on to here with some of those myths is the best leaders are first the best followers. I've heard it put this way: we can't be fathers if we haven't first been sons. And so that goes the same for women. We can't be mothers if we first haven't been daughters. And so the best leaders are first the best followers. Another truth about leadership is character trumps talent. Time and time again, you can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have the character, you might be a leader for a year, but I won't be following you at least. So
That's a good word.
The last truth here I want to share, and then we'll get into these 5 action steps, is leadership has a cost. And anybody who's been in leadership, they know that that is a true statement. I mean, these past months, I mean, just ever since March, February of 2020, has been one of the most difficult times probably in my lifetime, possibly for a lot of our lifetimes, to be a leader. I mean, who wants to lead in a pandemic?
Yeah.
No one does. Like,
Nope.
that's not like, that's like when you're like, man, leadership, I can't wait to lead. I can't wait to be in charge. I want that promotion. And then there's like a global pandemic and you're like pointing fingers at everybody else. And you're like, this is the time when I don't actually want to lead.
Yep.
So we've got to remember leadership has a cost. So we know it starts with us. Okay.
So let me ask you about that, Sam, because I think when we think about leadership as a cost, I think one of the big things, especially for ORU students, is the cost comes with time, right? Like there's a huge time commitment with leadership. Like if you step into a leadership position, it's going to cost time. It costs other things too, but would you speak to that just for a second of like, what have you learned about the cost of time? Because obviously you have to count the cost. You have to say like, man, it's going to cost me some time, but like, yeah, just speak to that level of like time involved with the cost.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a student here, I probably was not the best at managing my time. I love to be involved in everything, to do anything that I could.
Same, bro.
However, one thing I began to learn about the cost, especially when it comes to time and leadership, is that the cost isn't always paid with time. The cost is typically paid with deliberation. So being deliberate with our life.
Wow.
And so what we've got to understand is what are our priorities and where do we want to commit our lives? And then how can we deliberately live a life for those things?
Yeah.
And so what that means is if I'm saying yes to, let's say I'm saying yes to X leadership position, that means I'm probably saying no to X, Y, and Z personal involvement of things or X, Y, and Z leadership positions. And so with every yes comes a no, but also with every no, we have an opportunity to say yes to something else.
That's good.
And so that's where I've really seen it to just develop, just knowing that there's an opposite reaction to every decision that we make. We can't expect to watch 5 hours of Netflix and then also commit our time to lead teams in what we're doing or whatever spheres of influence we have.
Yeah, no, that's really good, bro. Really good.
Awesome. So that was a great question. I'm going to jump in here with these 5 action steps to leading when you're not in charge. And I want to try to make these as practical as possible. These are areas that I'm still growing. And I'm also going to try to spit out different resources for you guys, books, podcasts that have helped me along the way. What I've found is there aren't a lot of books that talk about this. There's actually a decent book on how to lead when you're not in charge, and that's literally the name of it. It's a pastor at North Point Church out in Atlanta, Georgia, with Andy Stanley. One of his staff members wrote that book. It's a good one. They've got some great podcasts, but what I've learned is almost intuitively trying to learn and pull from other resources that help us formulate, okay, what can I do to be the best team member, team player, leader, even when my title doesn't say it. So the first 3 of these 5 steps, I'm really pulling from a book that has really shaped a lot of how I try to even approach my work life. And that is called The Ideal Team Player by Patrick Lencioni. Highly, highly recommend it. It's an incredible audiobook style. But anyways, the whole premise of it is staying hungry, humble, and smart. So those are going to be the first 3 steps. And I want to dive right into number 1. And so leading when we're not in charge, we've got to stay hungry. And what I mean by that is not physically staying hungry for food, although that's a thing. It's staying hungry and passionate about what we're doing. And so not allowing ourselves to take a back seat and waiting for us to be called upon, but rather being proactive in what we do.
Yeah.
And so things that help us is asking like, hey, do I even believe in what I'm doing? Do I believe in what I'm putting my time towards? Because if we don't, we're probably not going to be hungry for or passionate about what we're doing. Someone is more willing to follow someone who believes in what they're doing than someone who just does a lot. So I would rather follow someone who believes in the thing that they're casting vision about, rather than someone who's just very, good at what they do. Another thing is just don't wait until you're in charge. That's one of probably the most practical steps you can take when you're leading. When you're not in charge, is just don't wait until you're in charge. I mean, it sounds almost like an oxymoron. Like, oh yeah, duh, of course. But so many of us wait, and then when we get in that position, we're like, well, what do I do? So if you set the example by waiting until you're in charge to take action, how can you expect those you are leading to do any different?
Yeah, that's good.
So if you want your followers to take initiative when you are in charge, then you need to be willing to take initiative when you aren't in charge.
Come on.
We've got to set that example. So create an environment of excellence, giving 110%, and people will want to follow that. No one wants to follow what's done halfway or not wholeheartedly. Lead by being hungry, by being passionate. Number two is staying humble. I know that can mean a lot of different things. It can be very ambiguous. But in leadership, we've got to remind ourselves that it's not about us. It's not about me. Leadership is not about you. And if leadership is about you, honestly, you'll probably fail at leading people. You'll just be a really good doer, or unfortunately, what could happen from that is create a toxic environment where you're using people as your platform. And I'm just trying to spit some facts here or some observations. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but kind of do sometimes. But second is you'll never be able to lead when you're not in charge if it's all about you. Because you're waiting for the title, you're waiting for the affirmation, you're waiting for the attention. If it's just about you, you're constantly wondering, why am I not in the spotlight? Why am I not getting the attention? Rather, we've got to remind ourselves that leadership's not about us. And I know we hear the term servant leadership a lot. I love that term. However, I've actually taken a little bit of a different approach, and I've recently stopped believing in the term servant leadership. But let me explain what that means before Augustine kicks me out of the door here.
No, I'm interested. I'm eager. I'm leaning in now.
Is that I believe that there's no true form of leadership outside of servant leadership, without serving. So I think that there shouldn't be a separate definition, because leadership without serving, honestly, I don't know how much we're leading when service and serving others or having an outside perspective than just inward is true leadership.
Wow, that's so good.
And so staying humble, it's not about you. Remain teachable. If you want to lead when you're not in charge, be teachable. Don't be arrogant. Don't pretend like you've got all the answers. Admit that you're wrong. Seek to listen. Seek to learn. And ask questions. What it does is, what I've found, I have one of the greatest bosses, I believe, around, Andre Heyer, here at ORU. Many of you guys who are part of our missions program can attest to that. But when we remain teachable, it doesn't just help us grow, but it empowers our leader to know that they can trust us and that we want their input and we want them as our leader.
Come on.
This instills trust in a healthy team culture. And so when we remain teachable, we ask questions. We're not only staying humble for our own sake, but we're telling our leader, I trust you and your input. So also with remaining humble, we got to honor at a cost. Take the eyes off of you, honor those above you, those below you, those beside you. But if there's a lesson I've ever learned about honor, is it doesn't come easy, doesn't come cheap. Oftentimes it will cost you, even if it's biting your own tongue. Another part of that stepping stone of humility in our leading when we're not in charge is taking ownership for our actions. There's a great book called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. He's an ex-Navy SEAL. It's a really awesome book. I highly recommend it. And it really is just the title of that. Take ownership. Never blame. Never point fingers. We can always find a lesson in the mistakes that we see around us, whether it was directly us or someone around us. And then the last thing about our second stepping stone is honor publicly, honor privately, but also be an honest critic personally. And I'll share a little bit about that at another point later on. So we've got step 1, stay hungry. Step 2, be humble. Step 3, be smart. And what I mean by this is not be the most intelligent, but actually talking about emotional intelligence. I know that this is a big topic these days where we're talking about emotional intelligence, finding out who we are, how we're wired. There's an awesome resource out there called Emotional Intelligence 2.0 but I'm pretty sure it's Tad Bradbury. I believe that's his name. I should have took note of that before. But if you look up Emotional Intelligence 2.0, you'll find it. That's the book. Take the self-assessment and learn from that. But it's not just about self-awareness of ourselves, and I think that's where oftentimes it can be a crutch for us. But it's about awareness of others and our effect on them.
Yeah.
So not just like, how can I be more self-aware and be a better person, but it's by being aware of who I am, how does that affect those around me?
That's good.
And so try to understand the weight and pressure that your boss is under and honor and serve that.
Yeah.
Sometimes as followers, we can just blame our bosses, we can blame our leaders, those over us. I mean, think about it on a national scale, a global scale. We love to point the finger. But when we stop and we take a moment and we try to understand the weight and pressure that they're under, and we honor and serve that, what we can actually do is set an example for those around us, to honor our leadership, to honor those that we're following. That's going to instill trust on your team, and really, believe it or not, you're going to be leading those around you even when you're not in charge by doing that. So you may begin to realize that the stress you're under is nowhere near the stress your supervisor or leader is under, and this will help you jump underneath and say, hey, I've got your back. It's going to help you take initiative when you understand your awareness, but then understand the awareness of those around you. So don't get caught up in the right idea too much. What makes an organization successful is more than just the right ideas, but it's about getting everybody rallied behind the same idea.
Yeah, that's good.
So learn what battles are worth fighting and what battles are not worth fighting. Being able to disagree with an idea, but then commit. So it's not about the idea becoming your idea, but it's about being like, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is the decision my leader chose to make. So now I've got to commit and get behind that. And so that takes incredible self-awareness of our part, but also an incredible amount of awareness of our supervisor, of our other leaders, of our teammates, whatever setting you may be in. And then the last thing there about being smart emotionally is our attitude. We cannot expect to lead other people if we got a bad attitude. I mean, that is so simple. I mean, I'm sure many of us can remember our parents or our guardians or leaders in our lives correcting our attitude. I know I used to be a brat. I'm still a brat, honestly, sometimes. I'm sure Augustine can attest to that.
No, you're perfect, Sam. I love you.
No, absolutely. But, if we don't check our own attitude and we've got a nasty attitude, like no one wants to be around that, but no one wants to follow a bad attitude. I mean, sometimes the best way I can understand, like, how can I be a better leader is I ask myself, would I follow that? And if you wouldn't follow that attitude, then change your attitude. Yeah. And if you don't avoid what you're feeling, but understand what you're feeling and then try to work past, why am I feeling this way? And how can I work towards changing my attitude?
So, question about attitude, because I think that's very real in leadership, and all of us feel that because we all deal with the attitude. What have been like a couple practical things that you've done, like in the moment, you're frustrated, you're annoyed, and you want to react a certain way. Your attitude says act this way, but inner leadership Sam says, no, I need to do this. What's your practical step for helping someone that is frustrated or is annoyed or wants to react a certain way? How do you advise them to like practically deal with their attitude?
That's a really great question, and we could probably have multiple podcasts just on that. But I'll share a couple things personally that I've done. One is I've found, well, actually I'm still trying to find, to be honest. I'm finding ways, one, how I personally can recharge in my own life, or how I personally process my emotions, and even like how I personally find ways that I connect with God. And so what I mean by all that is, in moments that I want to respond negatively, it looks like me keeping my mouth quiet and mouth shut and being slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen, try to seek to understand, hey, why did you respond this way? Asking myself, hey, why did they come up with this idea, or why did they blatantly avoid my recommendation or things? I mean, that doesn't really happen to me a lot, but in those sort of circumstances. But then it's also about finding, how do I process and how can I find ways to first calm my own heart, but then seek to understand. And so, honestly, I love being outside, outdoors, and so sometimes if I'm saying like this is top 10, this is frustrating me beyond
Yeah.
anything else. I feel like I just got like gypped or shortcutted or disrespected or something like that. Like sometimes I take drives in my car and
Yeah.
I just like yell out the emotion of what's happening.
No, that's good.
Or I go out on the lake. I take my kayak on the lake, and I'm like, man, what the heck is going on? Why is all this happening? Why am I so frustrated? Do I need to have a change of heart? But also, one of the most, I believe, strategic or influential things you can do is surrounding yourself with the right community to where you can have those conversations and express those disappointments. That does not mean just with all your buddies on your floors and stuff, but it's by surrounding yourself honestly with like really key one, two, maybe three. Three's kind of pushing it sometimes, like close knit, same gender, where you can dive deep in your frustrations, angers, disappointments, and you can grow from those things.
Yeah.
So I really believe having healthy relationships help us guide, shape our attitudes, and know when we're wrong, or when, hey, I need to stand up for this. Just like this is wrong, and what I'm seeing, I need to speak up. So that would be how I answer
really
your question.
That's super helpful. I'm taking notes.
No, I take notes from Augustine all the time.
Oh my gosh.
So let's get to these last two stepping stones here. So we covered Hungry, Humble, Smart. Again, ideal team player, Patrick Lencioni, awesome book. He dives way deeper into those things than I ever could. But then the last two are probably a little bit more unique of how we can lead when we're not in charge. One, I believe, is feedback. Another great book. I'm a big Patrick Lencioni fan. If you couldn't tell by this point, has this book called Five Dysfunctions of a Team. I believe is one of the I love reading books. There are hardly any books that I've had a hard time putting down when I read it. This is one of them.
Wow.
And he talks about what makes a dysfunctional team. And what I love about his writing style is he talks in leadership fables. So it's a story, but he's teaching the principles along the way. And so in that, he's talking about things like, hey, don't just agree with what's happening if you don't agree with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of us, there's that terminology of being a yes man. There are times when we need to suck it up and be like, you know what, I don't agree with this, but I need to go with that decision that's made. But if we never provide feedback in any sort of circumstance or any time we're in a meeting, or especially if our leaders are asking for feedback, then they want to hear your feedback. So give your feedback.
Yeah.
If we just go with it, we're not necessarily going to be leading when we're not in charge. But one of the most strategic ways we can lead when we're not in charge is by providing healthy feedback. And so what I like to say in that is if you're going to give a constructive feedback to something, pair it, sandwich it, whatever you want to call it, with an idea as well. So let's say Augustine's pitching an idea to me about this, which he wouldn't. It would be more him to Dr. Boyd or something like that, about a leadership podcast, for student life. And let's say Dr. Boyd didn't like the idea. He would maybe give maybe like, hey, I don't like the way that this is being presented, but how about this idea to involve, I don't know, other people or something like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's good.
Without just saying no and being critical about an idea from your team, especially from your leader, you want to maybe disagree and be honest, but then provide an idea of, hey, what about doing this instead, or something like that. So a way we can provide healthy feedback as opposed to just being critical and a Debbie Downer.
So good.
We don't want to be around that. So we also don't want to just be someone who's like following anything. It's like, yes, man, yes, man, yes, man. But we also don't want to be the critical Debbie Downers either. We want to bring fresh ideas, fresh perspective anytime we give feedback.
Yeah.
That may look like crucial conversations. I mean, that's difficult, and that's probably for like a whole nother thing, but there are times when we might need to have necessary conversations with our leaders or with those around us. Don't avoid those. If you're serving under a toxic leader and you're like, how do I lead under toxic leadership? Hopefully that's not the case here with us in student life. That's probably a different conversation to have. And I'm honestly probably not the best to ask about it. There's a lot of other people. I would go ask someone who's at least 50 or 60 probably on how they would answer that question.
Yeah.
Someone my age I just haven't lived enough life to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I've heard from other people is, hey, have I done absolutely everything I can? If the answer is yes, then maybe you need to start asking yourself, do I need to transition somewhere else?
Yeah.
And that's just a hard reality that we need to face. But with feedback, one thing that really is detrimental to a team is passive aggressiveness. So passive aggressiveness, I believe, is the Achilles heel to a healthy team.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sarcasm can breed that.
Yep.
And so I know we love trolling in our culture, in our society. I love it. I think it's hilarious. Contrary to popular belief, I like to troll sometimes as well.
You're such a troll. Contrary to popular belief, whatever. You're a troll.
But we got to be careful of when we're sarcastic, when we troll, because that can breed passive aggressiveness, especially to those who are listening. And that doesn't provide healthy feedback. It actually brings destructive feedback. And so another stepping stone on how you can lead when you're not in charge is providing healthy feedback. Don't just be a yes man, but also don't be a critic and a Debbie Downer. And don't be passive aggressive. Please don't be passive aggressive. No one likes that. Last thing for you guys is recognizing the cost in leadership. It's the last stepping stone to leading when you're not in charge. And so the 5 points, just an overview, is being humble, staying passionate about what we do. Don't wait until the position is given to you. Being humble. So hungry, humble. And so reminding ourselves, hey, it's not about you. Remain teachable, honor at a cost, take ownership for what you do. And then being smart emotionally, so being aware of ourselves. How do we affect other people? How am I affecting my boss? Am I bringing my boss down? Or am I being an encouragement? Am I being joy to them? Do they know that I trust them? And then the fourth one was feedback. So not being just a yes man, but providing healthy, constructive feedback, not being a critic. And then this last one, recognizing the cost in leadership. And that can be a difficult one. I know we talked a little bit about that at the beginning of this podcast. A few just quick points on that is know your motive. Check your motive before you go into leadership. Is your motive pure? If it's not, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong thing to do, but we might have to just check our heart along the way. We're humans, so our motives are going to get impure. But how can we purify our motive? And honestly, for all of us, especially young, I mean, I'm not really that much older than anybody's probably listening to this podcast, is count the cost ahead of time and don't quit evaluating the cost along the way. And so, we have that scripture in Luke where it talks about, the cost of discipleship, and it says the builders, they consider the cost of building a building before they build. And so just in that, like that, as we go into leadership or even as we follow Christ, we need to consider the cost before we do it. It doesn't have to be along the way all the time. And so many of us, we like to look busy and important, but we hate the responsibility. That is really dangerous there.
Yep.
Leadership will include responsibility if you didn't know that. Leadership will cost you something if you didn't know that. Leadership will be difficult. And sometimes I like to ask myself, hey, what am I giving up by taking this leadership opportunity about what I'm doing? And if you don't believe in what you're doing, just don't do it. And find something that you're willing to pay the cost for, and it's going to help you in the long run. And just a small note on this, especially with us millennial Gen Zs, people on the line, all that stuff, is when you are promoted and giving leadership, don't complain about the extra responsibilities you'll be given.
Yeah.
As you're promoted in leadership, as you're giving more opportunities, you will have more responsibility and it will cost you more. So don't complain. It's like, oh man, I wanted this pay raise and now I have to work until 6. Well, that's what you asked for. So why would you complain about it? And so know that that's there. One of the greatest quotes that have stood with me, that have impacted, challenged, changed my life, is this quote in a book that I would highly recommend by J. Oswald Sanders called Spiritual Leadership. And it says, the greatest fault in our mission is that no one wants to be second. And I think for all of us, it's a good reminder in leadership is, hey, am I just doing this because I want to be first? Because I want to be all eyes on me? or am I doing this because my motive is I believe in this organization, I believe in the mission, I believe in the vision. And if you believe in those things and you invest in those wholeheartedly, regardless if your title says director, if your title says manager, if your title says president, vice president, or if you're just a clerk, or if you're not a leadership position, you will lead those around you, because it's not about you, it's about accomplishing the mission and the goal of what you seek to do. And so I'd like to end it on that. And for anybody who's looking for other books or podcasts on these topics, I'll just kind of quickly list those.
Get out your pen and paper right now. You want to write these down. Or your phone. You can type it.
And, with all of us here at Student Life 2, we're always available to you guys. So hit us up if you're like, hey, what were some of those books? What were some of these things? And if anybody's like, hey, how would you... or you have questions about any of this stuff, feel free to reach out or come by my office or anything like that. I say that loosely, but I also mean it wholeheartedly. But books, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, The Ideal Team Player, both by Patrick Lencioni, Extreme Ownership, Jocko Willink, Spiritual Leadership by J. Oswald Sanders, and Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Tad Bradbury. And then podcasts that I've loved, I've learned a lot about leadership, is the Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast, Emotionally Healthy Leadership Podcast by Pete Scazzaro, and then At the Table by Patrick Lencioni would all be ones that I recommend. So thank you guys so much. Thank you, Augustine, for having me here on this podcast.
As we're wrapping up, you said a lot of great things, and hopefully you guys were all taking notes, because there's so much good stuff in there. But one last question I wanted to ask you, Sam. First of all, I think you exemplify these things in your own leadership really well. I've seen that over the last few years. And, as students are involved with missions and outreach, hopefully they get to see that from you and from Anj, and just the leadership structure that you guys have there. So my question to you would be, specifically in regards to leading when you're not in charge, how would you suggest a student who wants to be in charge someday, what is a piece of advice you would give them before they get in charge? So before you get in charge, here's the one thing you should prepare yourself for, because when you get in charge, this is going to happen. What would that be?
Wow, one piece of advice is a really great question. I would probably, maybe it's a 2-part answer here. One, I'd say be like a radical learner. Just learn. Yeah. Sit at the feet of those that that are leading you. Find mentors, ask questions, be hungry to learn. But I would also say, and I say this, hopefully with humility in my heart, is also take note of things that you don't want to do. Especially if you're being led by someone where maybe you're like, I would do that differently, or those are okay to think about. It's not, I think sometimes we can condemn ourselves to be like, everybody that's leading me is perfect.
Yeah.
It's okay to be like, wow, they have their leadership style, mine's going to be different. Here's how it's going to be different.
Yeah.
So I would do both, and seek to learn, be a radical learner, but then also take note of, man, I've seen some of these things be harmful. This is how I would do things differently. And if your leaders are, they want to build you up, they're going to want you to succeed beyond themselves. And then that way, when you're leading, then you would want your followers to succeed beyond yourself as well. And so hopefully we're just growing and growing and growing from then on out.
That's super good. Thanks for sharing that, Sam. And Sam, thanks for being on the podcast, sharing some wisdom. I think all of us would agree that we never arrive in leadership, but we always have something to pass on. So super thankful for you and missions and outreach and all that you guys do every year. And so as we conclude, just would encourage you as our listeners to continue to listen to the Student Life Leadership Podcast. If you have anyone that you think would be awesome for the Student Life Leadership Podcast, find Sam, find me, find another Student Life staff member, and we'd love to try to get them on here. But until next time, this is Augustine and Sam Kyle saying so long. Thanks for tuning in to the Student Life Leadership Podcast.